Okay, if I can open the seminar. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This event is organised by the Arab Organisation for Human Rights in the UK, which publishes often daily reports on the human rights situation in the Arabic-speaking world. The website is aohr.org.uk. Or if I could just ask you all to mute your headphones. Thank you much. The topic of tonight's discussion is the continuing displacement of Palestinians by the forces of the Israeli occupation. And our emphasis will be on home demolition and settlement and on Palestinian resistance, both within historic Palestine and amongst the diaspora, to that same dispossession. That process has sharpened over the last years. For just one example, in last year alone, in the occupied West Bank alone, over 900 Palestinian-owned structures were demolished by Israeli forces, which displaced well over 1,000 people. And that was the second highest number of such demolitions since of any year since 2009. To that, we must add the appalling effects of the attack against Gaza, which killed 192 Palestinians, resulted in numerous injuries, and of course the destruction of property, including medical centres, primary schools, and many private residences. In response to that violence, there was a tremendous wave of resistance across historic Palestine, linking the various areas, which serves as the immediate conjuncture for tonight's discussions, I think. That resistance found echo across the whole world. Here in London, there were tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people protesting, several protests. We have, I believe, 8 speakers tonight. And so I'll end my introduction there. The format that I suggest is that each speaker takes up to 5 minutes, with an extra minute allowed if necessary. And then we move to after those 8 have spoken, we move to a general discussion based on rounds of 3 questions. If I can introduce each speaker in turn in the order in which they'll speak. James Zogby is the founder and president of the Arab American Institute based in Washington, and he'll speak on forced displacement and settlement. Mahmoud Salhiya is a Palestinian homeowner within the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and he'll speak to us on the situation in the neighborhood. Ilan Pape is an expatriate historian, socialist activist, professor, and professor at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter here in Britain. And he'll speak to us on how Palestinian civil society can stand against home demolitions and related practices. Nicholas Squires is a solicitor here in Britain and a former senior lecturer in law at Coventry University. Dr. Ralph Wilde is at UCL's Faculty of Laws, again in Britain, and will speak to us on the uses of international law in relation to Palestinian rights. Dr. Milal Shabaki is the head of the Political Sciences Department at Hebron University, and will speak to us on colonial settler policies and their effects on Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. Amy Shallan is the co-director of McCann and will speak on the shrinking space for Palestinian advocacy in Britain. And last but not least, Dr. Shahid Abu Salama is a Palestinian feminist writer, activist, artist, and journalist, and she will speak to us on the impacts of home demolition on Palestinians. And I'd like to extend a personal expression of solidarity with Dr. Abu Salama in light of recent attacks against her in the media. And if I may, then introduce our first speaker, James Ogby. Oh, and excuse me, James. I'm sure everybody will stick to the allotted 5 minutes, but in the if that doesn't happen, I'll reserve the right to remind them after 5.5 minutes. And thank you, James. You have the floor.
How very polite of you. Thank you all very much. I think that we're having this conversation at a very auspicious time. The release of the report by Amnesty International has certainly been, I think, a significant development. I remember when I started the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in the 70s, I was working at the time with Felicia Langer and Israel Shahak, two human rights leaders in Israel. And both had given me cases of torture victims, of people who had been administrative detainees, and of some homes that were being demolished as a part of the, at the time, collective punishment that Israel was using. I brought them to Amnesty US and was told that we're sorry, we can't take that case. It's too controversial here. We would lose support if we adopted it. So we decided to form our own Palestine Human Rights Campaign, and the campaign grew rather rapidly in terms of its base of support. And we had continued to grow in the 80s. The Jesse Jackson campaign, I was deputy campaign manager of that, introduced a plank on Palestinian rights and justice. It was the first time that there had ever been such a discussion in the Democratic Party. That was then 30 to 40 years ago. The ground has shifted considerably. The fact that in just this year, in addition to Israeli groups, two US-based organizations in London, Amnesty being both London and US, have come out with rather significant reports on Israeli practices constituting the war crime of apartheid, has been very important. Important in that there's a changed consciousness that is developing not only in the US, but globally. And among decisive demographic groups, young people in particular, and people of color. In America, the polling numbers, as you look at young Blacks, young Latinos, young Asians, young people generally, and the rest of the public, rather significant. New sources of information are available, and a global consciousness has taken hold among youth that, since we've been observing this now for the last decade or so, actually 15 years, what we found is that it doesn't change as they get older. It's not a function of, I'm young, I think this way, but as I get older, my attitudes harden. Actually, the age cohort of those who continue to have progressive ideas on Palestinian rights has now grown into those under 40. So there is a change. So Amnesty speaks today, Human Rights Watch speaks today in an environment that is ready to listen. The classic response from Israel, which was to issue talking points, not focused on the issues, not focused on home demolition, not focused on the racism implicit in their practices on home demolition and settler expansion, but on the term apartheid, was indicative of the fact that they don't have a case to make. And so all they can do is demonize the reporter and attempt to just pummel into submission those who might embrace it. That's a tactic that worked years ago, and it's not working today. We're already seeing reverberations of this in terms of organizations in the US that are mounting support for the Amnesty claim. Let's look at what Amnesty said, one, and two, what this issue of displacement is all about. From the beginning, there was a plan. It was to seize strategic areas of land in order to constitute Jewish control over the land of Palestine. It wasn't by accident. I mean, when the Jewish National Fund was formed, they actually mapped villages and mapped land ownership and mapped productivity of that land in order to target the ones that they would attempt to buy, and when failing to purchase, would then seize in 48 and expel residents. The idea of planting trees was not to beautify or make green the area, but it was to erase the presence of Palestinians from those areas. It was the villages that were destroyed in the Nakba and the aftermath of the Nakba that were the areas that were planted as forests. The fact that the forestry that they planted, the trees that they planted, were not indigenous and therefore have been prone to forest fires, it simply adds insult to injury. The action most recently to plant trees in the Nakab in order to claim that land from the Bedouin who farm the land and who live on the land, to Judaize the land by planting trees on it, is simply part of that same practice. There are a couple of factors, I think, that need to be understood. One is that there is a plan for which lands get seized. It started with just most productive and those that would form contiguous Jewish space in Palestine. After 48, in Israel itself, it was to seize land around population concentration areas. And an Israeli sociologist called what happened to the Arab residents of Nazareth and other Arab communities, they became landless peasants. Collective ownership was outside. They owned the land outside. When the land outside was seized, they lost their productive land. They became day laborers in Israeli businesses in Nazareth, elite, etc. That same practice was put into place in the West Bank, which is why when you look at the West Bank, you see little circles. It's because the land around them has been taken according to a strategic plan. And the strategic plan is also was outlined in what was called the Drobel's plan in the 70s, that said that they would build settlements in the interior connected by roads and infrastructure in order to make it impossible for there to be a future contiguous Palestinian state.
And if I can ask you to wrap up in 1 minute, please.
Put it in place. Now in Jerusalem, we have something quite similar underway, which is to establish a Jewish dominance in East Jerusalem and to make it contiguous and therefore controllable. Hence, building Jewish settlement inside East Jerusalem, building infrastructure, an amusement park, green space. All of this is to enhance Jewish domination over the indigenous Palestinian, making it impossible for them to remain or to ever become a dominant force in their own society.
Thank you very much. Mahmoud, are you with us? I believe the plan is for Mahmoud to speak for 5 minutes, and then for the translator after him to give us his contribution in English. So Mahmoud, تفضل.
السلام عليكم. سامعيني؟ أنا محمود صلاحية من القدس. تهجرنا من سنة 48 من بلدنا من عين كارم، ورجعوا هلا بنمرروا كمان مرة يهجرونا بال 2022 من بيوتنا. الأسلوب اللي بيستعملوه آخر فترة معنا الإسرائيليين أسلوب تهجير من القدس وتفريغ من القدس. يفرغونا من بيوتنا. البلدة القديمة فرغوها، المحلات فرغوها. بيتبعوا معنا أسلوب تهجير زي ما اتبعوا أسلوب الهجانة بسنة 48. البلد عندنا ميتة، بيهجروا في الناس من بيوتها، بيهدوا بيوت، بيعطوش ترخيصات. البلد تفرغت عنا، بتنزل على السوق ما فيش حدا بالاسواق بالبلد القديمه. دورنا بيهدوا لنا اياها، بيطلعونا من دورنا. الاسلوب اللي اتبعته الاحتلال اتبعوه معي، انهم يجوا يطلعوا 15 نفر اولاد صغار من دورهم الساعه 3 بالليل، يخشوا علينا ويطلعونا من دورنا الساعه 3 بحجه بلديه القدس انها بدها تسوي مدارس. هاي حجه وهمه، حجه تبعتهم مش مزبوطه. هم بدهم يهجروا كل اهالي القدس، بدهم يسووا تطهير عرقي. الحكومه اللي جاي علينا حكومه بنت، هاي حكومه مستوطنين داخله تسوي تطهير عرقي في البلد. ما بدهم فلسطينيين في القدس، ما بدهم مش حدا في القدس. أن الو سامعيني؟ سامعين؟
سامعينك.
مسموع
Yes. أستاذ محمود كمل. احنا سامعينك. أنا المترجمة معك ألفة التوني. نستناك تكمل يعني الخطاب تبعك والتدخل تبعك، وبعدين تكون ترجمة بالإنجليزي، يعني واصل بدون انقطاع إن شاء الله.
ماشي هيك سامعين. إيه، الأسلوب اللي اتبعوه معنا أسلوب تهجير. المستوطنين اليوم حكومة مستوطنين عندنا، الحكومة الموجودة عندنا حكومة مستوطنين. لما بتيجي الحكومة على البلد زي على القرى وبتدخل المستوطنين بحراسة من جيش الاحتلال، بيقولوا لهم خشوا كسروا الدور واضربوا الناس. شو اسمه هذا؟ اسمه تطهير عرقي. داخلين دخلة قوية. احنا البلد عندنا اليوم مهمشة، ما حدا بتطلع علينا من بلاد برا بالمرة. أنوق يعني بسووا السلام تبع قصة أوصل هاي السلام إنه ال67. طب وين احنا؟ طب امشوا على ال67 زي ما بتقولوا تمشوا على ال67، ماشيين على أرض ال67. وين ال67؟ القدس هاي محتلة. ليش مش معترفين العالم فيها إنها محتلة؟ ليش ما حدا بيحكي علينا؟ احنا هلا بنواجه هجمة كبيرة في القدس، هجمة تطهير عرقي. طلوع من بيوت، بخلوا الناس تهد بيوتها في ايديها، بيطلعوا الناس من بيوتها بنصاص الليالي. اولاد صغار محبسين من 10 من 11 سنة 12 سنة. ما عمري شفت انا بلد ديمقراطية زي ما بيقولوا عن حالهم هم ديمقراطية، بيحبسوا اولاد عمره 12 سنة و13 سنة و14 سنة. اولاد محبسين. الناس زهقت عنها بالبلد، ما فيش إلنا لا أبو ولا أم، ما حداش بطالب فينا. اليهود معهم إيد مفتوحة يسووا اللي بدهم إياه. إحنا حاسين إنه يعني معطينهم، حتى العالم معطينهم إيد مفتوحة، إنكم سووا الفلسطينيين اللي بدكم إياه.
محمود لو سمحت ممكن تكلمنا عن القرار بتاع الهدم؟ طلع من المحكمة ولا طلع من البلدية قرار الهدم؟ واعترضتوا عليه ولا لا؟ كان عندكم وقت قد ايه للاعتراض وما الى ذلك؟ احكي لنا عن قرار الهدم لو سمحت.
إحنا كان في عندنا محكمة 23 شهر، وما استنوا 23 شهر. بعدين القرار اخلى علي، بس أنا وعلى مرتي، يعني أمي وأختي والمحلات اللي كان عندي ما عندهم قرار اخلى. هم اتبعوا أسلوب عصابات، لانه لما اجوا اخلوني من البيت هم لازم يخلوني من البيت انا ومرتي بس. اما أنا اهلي ما كان لازم يخلون من البيت، والبيت اللي عندي ممنوع ينهد لانه بيت تاريخي. هم دخلوا في الليل، لا طلعوا على المحكمة العليا اللي بيقولوا عن حالها محكمة عليا عندهم. المحكمة العليا قررت انه الاخلاء بس علي وعلى مرتي. طب انتوا اجيتوا اخليتوا امي واختي والمحلات اللي فوق بدون قرار. يعني اسلوب عصابات. انا لما بطلع على المحكمة، طلعت على المحكمة كان لازم 23 الشهر يكون في محكمة انه وقف تنفيذ. هم اجوا قبل 23 الشهر ونفذوا القرار واخلوا اهلي من الدار وهدوا المحلات، مع انه القرار اللي معهم مش قانوني بالمرة.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud.
اهلا وسهلا، شكرا لكم كثير كثير.
And Ulfa, I believe if you would begin your translation.
Okay, just 1 minute. So, thank you for having you all with us today. I'm Olfa, a researcher at the Urban Organization for Human Rights. I'm going to translate the intervention of Mahmoud Salahia. Mahmoud was narrating how Israel or Israeli authorities evicted him along with his 50 members of his family, including his sons, mother and sister and wife. He said that Israel is conducting or is carrying out ethnic cleaning policy against Palestinian Jerusalem. And this is the same policy Israel has carried out in 1948 against Palestinians. He said that the old city in Jerusalem is subjected to an ethnic cleaning policy, systematic displacement policy in profit of settlement expansion or settlement construction. This is all was carried out by Bennett government. He said that Bennett's government or the Israeli government, the Israeli current government is carrying out a systematic attack on the Palestinian prisons in Jerusalem and ethnic cleaning policy against the Palestinian prisons in Jerusalem in total violation to the international laws and the 1967 borders. He said that Israel doesn't respect the 1967, and no one in the international community or the international or the European countries and so on, no one has intervened to stop this bloodshed. He said that no one has intervened to stop the ethnic cleaning. Even their sons, minors sons, aged 12 and 19, are all jailed in Israel. This is all what he said, I think. Hope that I take the main notes.
Thank you so much for that. Much appreciated. And again to Mahmoud, thank you very much, and of course solidarity to you.
شكرا كثير لك.
Next we have Professor Ilan Pape, but I'm afraid I don't see his name amongst the participants, unless he's user, which seems unlikely. Ilan, you there? I suppose not. Hopefully he can join us later. If we move then to Nicholas Squires, please, you have the floor.
Right, I'm here as an observer, so I was down as a speaker, but I'm not actually speaking. So,
oh, excuse me. Well, perhaps you could ask a question during the discussion.
I'll hope to join in the discussion, yes.
Okay. In that case, if we move to Dr. Ralph Wilde, who I can see is indeed with us. Hi, Ralph.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you all. So it's common, of course, to invoke and seek to enforce international law as a means of vindicating the right of the Palestinian people. And related to this is the idea that if only the law were enforced, emancipation would be realized, or put differently, that the lack of Palestinian liberation is due to the violation of the law with impunity. However, international law is embedded with the ideology and techniques of imperialism and colonialism. I've just published an article in the Palestine Yearbook of International Law, which provides a critical evaluation of what is at stake when international law is invoked in the context of the Palestinian struggle. The full text of the article can be downloaded open access at the link that I've just posted in the chat. And what I do now is I'll summarize the main conclusions. So it's important to appreciate that in certain key respects, the starting point as far as international law is concerned on this subject is to accept Israeli statehood as a given, and that Palestinian freedom should somehow fit around Israel's needs. So, for example, the territory commonly understood by international lawyers to be covered by the legal right of self-determination of the Palestinian people is that which is left of the territory of the Palestine Mandate once Israel is taken into account. Occupation law, the international law framework commonly, sometimes exclusively invoked in the Palestinian context, is concerned not with ending the occupation, but with merely humanizing it within the overall framework of domination. Moreover, even to invoke the standards of occupation law, it's necessary to recognize Israel's statehood, because occupation law only applies to states. And this has to be done when, of course, it is statehood that is the very thing that the occupation prevents the Palestinian people from realizing effectively. And this implicit recognition of Israeli statehood has to be made despite the fact, of course, that it is statehood on the part of Israel that was created through and continues to operate on the basis of the Nakba, with the consequent position of many Palestinian people as refugees and the treatment of Palestinian people within Israel as second-class citizens. Now, the international law on the use of force and self-determination do offer a basis for challenging the legitimacy of the continued existence of the occupation. And this can pave the way for the limited version of freedom international law offers to the Palestinian people, statehood in a territory outside the green line defined borders of Israel. It also renders unlawful Israeli annexation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. But sometimes commentators are fixated on the prohibition of annexation without also addressing ending the occupation. And to make the argument on that requires moving beyond the annexation prohibition fixation and also the occupation fixation to a further fixation that is very common, including within the so-called international community, that Palestinian self-determination should only be realized once there's a peace agreement. Actually, in international law, this is not correct. There is a legal basis for an immediate end to the occupation, applying the law on the use of force, which is the only basis on which Israel can lawfully maintain the occupation as a defensive mechanism. And this leads to the conclusion, as I set out in the article, that the occupation is illegal and constitutes aggression, which is a crime in international law. However, most experts fail to address this area of law, therefore making it more difficult to appreciate the significance of it, let alone to invoke and apply it. Moreover, making the challenge requires an assessment through a framework exclusively concerned with the question of Israel's security needs. Moreover, it's difficult to make the self-determination element of this critique. This is in part because of the way the case law, the legal approach of international human rights law, where self-determination is a legal right in law, often downgrades and sometimes even completely ignores the significance of external self-determination, the right to be free from domination, which is the right that the Palestinian people have. Indeed, this approach to downplay or ignore external self-determination is evident in the practice and statements of international UN human rights bodies, but also human rights NGOs, such as, indeed, Amnesty International. Just as with the exclusive occupation law focus, these entities tend to address ultimately second-order issues only, such as whether or not the treatment of the Palestinian people constitutes apartheid, as in the recent report, without also considering whether the occupation is in and of itself a violation of the right of self-determination. Indeed, it's as if the Palestinian right to external self-determination does not even exist. Moreover, paradoxically, when these human rights bodies have addressed the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel, this has partly included coverage of their right to participate in the collective self-determination unit of that state. So Palestinian self-determination gains attention, but only indirectly via participation in and as part of the collective self-determination unit of the Israeli people. This brings things back full circle to where I started: Israeli statehood and the legal consequences that flow from its recognition.
Oh, thank you so much. That's brilliant. Lovely.
I think someone needs to mute there. Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't see who that was to mention the name. So to conclude then, the common critique made of international law is that it may be all well and good, but it's not enforced because of power imbalances and politics. My article foregrounds the existence of these imbalances and political preferences in the law and the law's role in enabling them. Of course, it is for the Palestinian people to decide what is in their best interests as regards the deployment of international legal arguments and recourse to international legal mechanisms. What I'm seeking to do in this piece is identify some of the issues at stake with the general features of the international legal system that might be relevant when these decisions are made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next is Dr. Milal Shabaki. Again, the head of political science, the political science department at Hebron University.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Actually, I would like to talk today about the Israeli policy in Jerusalem, and specifically about the economic policies and developmental policies. Initially, the media focuses mostly on the direct aggressive policy of Israel, such as displacement and demolition of houses in Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. But I think it's necessary also to discuss and highlight the hidden policies of the Israeli occupation in Jerusalem. And maybe let me put it in this way: indirect policies of the Israeli occupation in Jerusalem under the umbrella of development or economic plans and etc. So the Palestinians who remain in Jerusalem after An-Naksa in 1967 have to face on a daily basis the aggressive policies of the Israelis, as Mahmoud Salhi just mentioned before 10 minutes about what he is facing in Al-Quds. However, I believe that it's important to focus on these issues, but also it's a very necessary to highlight the plans that the Israeli governments promote each year to continue its controls to the Palestinian territories and specifically in Jerusalem. And to discuss this issue, I prefer to divide it into 3 stages. The first stage from An-Naksa until 1997. And because I have only 5 minutes, I will give you just an examples about our indicators about the Israeli policies under the umbrella of legislation or economic development. So at that time, in 1997, the first military order was the dissolving of the elected Arab Council in Jerusalem. And after 1 year of that, I mean, in 1968, they issued another military order, and which state that the Israeli government can control hundreds of dunams of the territories of Jerusalem. And the most dangerous plan was what is so called nowadays the settlements built around Jerusalem. They established around 15 settlements around Jerusalem, and they achieved two goals by establishing this build. The first one, to control a new territories around Jerusalem. And the second one, which is more important from my point of view, to make a separation between the Palestinian community in Jerusalem and the Palestinian community around Jerusalem. In this case, the Palestinians in Jerusalem will lose the central position of this city, I mean, in the economic level, because in this case, the Palestinians will stop their investments in this city, and they will go, for example, to Hebron or to Nablus or to Jenin to establish their investments. At the same time, the Israeli government start to encourage the Israeli investments inside this city. And for example, in 1972, they declared the special development plan. And according to this plan, the Israelis, they can start their industry, their projects inside this city, and they make advanced traffic system to connect Jerusalem with the rest of the Palestinian territories, which was occupied in 1948. The second stage started in 1980s, and 1980s, it was a turning point in the history of Palestine, when the Israeli Knesset voted for a new basic law to consider Jerusalem as a united capital of Israel. After 80 years of that basic law, they approved the new law also to improve the city. And if we focus on these words or vocabularies that they use, development, economic improvement, and such ideas, just to cover their aggressive policies against the Palestinians. And at that time, Ishaq Shamir, the prime minister at that time in Israel, he encouraged the Israelis to establish new factories inside that city, inside Al-Quds, and they prevented the Palestinians to establish their own investments in the city. Also, during the time where the PLO was negotiating with the Israelis in Madrid and in Oslo, and after the signing of Oslo Accords, in 1994, the Israeli government issued a new law which restricted the Palestinian activities in Jerusalem and the rest of the Palestinian territories in West Bank. And this will give us an indicators about the Israeli plan regarding the two-state solutions. I will go directly to the third stage after 2000. During that time, the Palestinians, especially the Palestinian people in Jerusalem, they started the second intifada against the Israeli policies, especially in the old city after the visit of Ariel Sharon. During that time, during the second Intifada, Ariel Sharon started to talk about the apartheid wall, which is not well known now by the rest of the world. Through this wall, I mean the apartheid wall, Israel succeeded to separate 140,000 of the Palestinians outside the borders of Al-Quds. There are many examples about the policies of the Israeli occupation in Jerusalem, but the most famous one, E1 and E2, and the project with a number 5,800, which have a vision about the city until 2050, which will convert the city from a holy city to an industrial city. I think that's what I have for today. And if there is something during the discussion, I will add. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Milal. Much appreciated. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Amy Shalan, who again is the co-director of McCann, based in Britain.
Thank you. In recent years, we've witnessed how it's becoming increasingly difficult in Britain to be vocally supportive of Palestinian rights without coming under attack in the political sphere, in arts and education institutions, and also in the media. And these attacks are coming in various forms, through the demonization and defamation of people and organizations, through surveillance and suspicion of particular groups, especially young Muslims, and also attacks on non-violent civil society tactics that are pushing for Israel's accountability, such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This hostile climate for supporters of Palestinian rights is an attempt to push the cause of Palestine to the margins and create barriers to effective mobilization. Of course, British complicity in the suppression of Palestinian rights struggles is nothing new, starting with the Balfour Declaration. But in recent years, Britain has not only stepped up its efforts on the international stage, adopting a highly regressive approach towards platforms in which Palestinians might have an opportunity to assert their rights, such as the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court, but also through its domestic policies and practices. We've seen a number of education institutions come under mounting pressure to demonstrate compliance with the government's prevent strategy, which is curtailing progressive dissent, with staff being advised to risk assess and manage Palestine-related activism as part of their prevent duty responsibilities. And this repressive environment is also being shored up by the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes criticism of Israel and Zionism as examples of anti-Semitism, and is being increasingly adopted across institutions in Britain and elsewhere. As a result, we've seen multiple cases where activists and academics expressing support for Palestinian rights and taking positions critical of Israel have been harassed and even punished. And I believe we're going to hear from Shahid, who's perhaps the most recent example. But this chilling effect isn't only occurring in universities, it's also happening in British schools. In May last year, the then Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, sent a letter to head teachers in the aftermath of a wave of protests by British students in solidarity with Palestinians. The protests have resulted in a number of pupils being subjected to disciplinary action, and one head teacher had even gone so far as to describe the Palestinian flag as a call to arms and symbol of anti-Semitism. Gavin Williamson didn't question why students had been accused of anti-Semitism or subjected to disciplinary action. Instead, he instructed schools not to present materials in a politically biased or one-sided way, and said that they should not work with or use materials from organizations that publicly reject Israel's right to exist. Needless to say, he made no mention of Palestinian rights, and specifically the Palestinian right to self-determination. While this approach purports to take a stand against discrimination and bias, in reality, it has the effect of marginalizing and stifling pupils of Palestinian origin from speaking about their own history and lived experience, as well as censoring pupils who wish to show solidarity with Palestine. The Labour Party is taking a similar stance. In November last year, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, gave a speech at Labour Friends of Israel event in which he praised Israel as a bastion of democracy, at a moment when mainstream human rights organizations were declaring Israel to be an apartheid state, and Israel was openly cracking down on leading Palestinian human rights groups by designating them as terrorist organizations. In his speech, Starmer repeatedly equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and explicitly condemned anti-Zionist policies. He then went a step further with a colonialist claim that Israel had made the desert bloom, a reference to a statement by former Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, suggesting that the land was barren under indigenous Palestinians and only progressed thanks to Zionist efforts in Palestine. While it's difficult not to feel demoralized by the approach of leading British politicians, we should acknowledge that it's also a sign of the success of the Palestinian rights struggle. We are in a new global moment where the decades-old framing of both sides, one state, two sides state and peace process is being unpicked, and where more and more people and human rights organizations are using the language of apartheid and colonialism to describe Israel's oppression of Palestinians. As Israel comes up against this shift in global consciousness, we can expect heightened attacks, and support for Palestinian freedom and the shrinking space for it is raising serious questions around freedom of expression, political activism, and state surveillance that cannot be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And our last speaker, but not least, Dr. Shahid Abu Salama, speaking Brit.
Hello, guys. Thank you so much. Sorry, my voice is a bit gone. I am really thankful for all of you. I know how a lot of you have been supporting me throughout the past weeks and beyond. But today I'm very happy to be addressing you after a few days of defeating Israel's lobby groups and the Hasbara Brigade that literally came after a Palestinian refugee who broke free of Israel's oppression in besieged Gaza, only to be chased wherever I went. And this is basically a reminder that that we are challenging huge forces. And I'm very thankful for the previous speaker for highlighting the discourse of hostility that we are facing, with the previous education minister literally preaching universities' economy and interfering with universities' business, telling them that they would be facing funding cuts if they didn't adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, this just shows the influence and also the colonial entrenched legacy that this country is still basically embracing, and we are like this. What I have been facing, the smear campaigns, the IHRA, that is like in itself a very political tool that is dismissive of the Palestinian experience and is inherently racist against the Palestinians, because it's actually designed to silence us and to silence advocates for Palestine. So I'm honestly like, I know, like I'm happy now. I'm talking to you from a better place. I'm stronger. I've already been back to teaching my module, post-colonial media culture, which literally brings the post and the post-colonial to like exposure. And the module couldn't become more personal with my story. And I have been back to teaching, and I'm happy about that, but I am still facing a backlash from Zionist publications that are still like, you know, stooping lower and lower in order to, you know, I mean, like, it is part of the psychological warfare that they practice against the Palestinians. I call it ideological terror, and I have experienced both military and ideological and psychological terror under Israel. So I'm very experienced in that regards. And however, like, we need to take some learning lessons from this. The support that my case has galvanized across the globe, from Palestine to the UK to South Africa, the US, all over really, has been astonishing. And this pressure, this political pressure, is what made us win and defeat the IHRA and expose its inadequacy and its threat upon academic freedom. This is something that we should take from this experience. During the past few weeks, so many student groups got involved, UCU branches, academic committees, non-academic committees, you know, grassroots organizations, everybody, of course, not to forget the legal support that I've been receiving from the European legal support center. So all of this together have created this beautiful show of solidarity that made us expose how racist really and malicious those Zionist smears are, and how they are literally designed to distract from Israeli crimes that we ourselves stand witness to, and we are still dealing with the consequences of a life of terror that has been meted out against us. You know, like, I'm still in disbelief that the university had actually suspended me and disrupted my students' education under Zionist pressure. However, it is a great response. I mean, it is an amazing victory that we have all achieved by forcing the university to acknowledge its complete mishandling of the situation, and it's also denial of my right to represent myself, because let's not forget that I have learned from the Zionist press that my university has been investigating me. And when I finally knew from my university, a month later, on the 20th of January, it came in the form of a suspension. And this is this shocking treatment has become legitimized really with the use of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that deliberately conflates between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism to protect Israel from accountability. So whenever they try to distract us and to disperse our energy, let us just pull back a little bit and go back to the center, bring the conversation back to the center. They are very good at manipulating and twisting truths, but we have a very just cause and our grievances are legitimate. And what we are calling for are basic rights, very basic rights. We want freedom, justice, equality, and return to our lands. And if people are anti-racist, they have to support Palestinian aspirations for freedom, justice, and equality. And they have to support as well our resistance to achieve those aspirations and join us as allies in our struggle to achieve those demands. And an alternative reality is possible where Palestine is free. An alternative reality of being Jewish is also possible without existing at the expense of eliminating others. Thank you so much. It's still fresh, you know, and the issues are like, whenever I start talking about them, they are, I feel like I'm living them again. But it was amazing listening to all of you and to see how all of you are resisting from wherever you are. And we are definitely facing and witnessing positive changes. I mean, like, finally, Amnesty International has addressed the obvious and supported the Palestinians in what they've already been talking about and raising before international community. So I hope that this is going to break Israel's culture of immunity that continues to fuel violence against us. I want to remind, I just wanted to pick up something that James spoke at the beginning, because he mentioned somebody called Felicia Langer and Israel Shahak. And these people have worked with my father. They knew him personally. And I'm holding Felicia Langer's book in my hand, where she's recording my father's story as she defended him in 1972 and miserably failed to bring him justice. And people like Felicia Langer is an example that I have grew up with. When my father made sure that he tells me about her, because in order to understand what we are fighting against, and the difference between Zionism and between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and all these things. And Felicia Langer once upon a time gave me hope and gave my father hope that even the Israelis themselves can open their eyes and move away from this supremacist ideology that enables Israel's foundation and maintenance at the expense of our dehumanization and demonization. And it's time that people and justice lovers around the world to speak up for Palestine. If you oppose anti-Semitism, then you oppose racism against the Palestinian Arabs. And it's time that we call out the crimes, not only call them out, but also bring them before justice. people like Felicia Langer eventually left Israel because she believed that she wasn't going anywhere in its apartheid so-called justice system. She wasn't serving any justice through it. She believed that she was giving legitimacy rather to the apartheid justice system by being part of it. And eventually she left Israel and went to Germany and continued to fight as an ally in the Palestinian liberation struggle until she died. And here we are now continuing on the steps of money and keeping their stories alive for the sake of both, the collective freedom of both, because Zionism, I believe, is another way of occupation of the mind. And those who believe that an apartheid supremacist state, a religious, ethno-religious supremacist state is going to be a safe haven for the Jews, they are so wrong. They are so wrong, and the Ayat Sharia has been called out. And I think our next challenge, especially as people outside in the West, is to address those chains of complicities that fuel the violence meted out against the Palestinians, whether in academia, in the form of repressive policies such as the Ayat Sharia, or in the form of collaborations with Israeli companies that basically profit from the oppression of the Palestinian people. Just recently, in early January, we managed to achieve a massive victory for Palestine when we managed to shut down Elbit Systems, an Israeli arms giant that pretends to be a normal factory as it stands here outside people's doorsteps, so close to people's homes and schools, while they literally battle test their weapons on the children majority population of Gaza. How could this be acceptable under any religion, under any conventions, under any human rights framework? So it is our political effectiveness as well that is increasing. We are learning, I think, and we are getting very efficient and very good at working together and supporting one another, and also attacking Israel where it hurts most, its image and its economy, and our political effectiveness is reaching a critical level where Israel is threatened by simple phrases such as Free Palestine or solidarity is a verb. And this is the insecurity that makes them dismiss any of our legitimate demands as anti-Semitic. Thank you all for listening, and I'll pass to the next.
Thank you much, Shahid. In place of Ilan Pathé, I've been informed that we're joined by Khalid Safori, if I've pronounced that right, who will speak to us now from Washington, DC for 5 minutes maximum, if that's okay, Khalid. After which we'll move to a general discussion, including questions and answers from the wider group.
Thank you very much. I would like to focus probably on how the Palestinian issue is covered in the US and how our forces working against the Palestinian issue in the US, because this is a different phenomenon than the rest of the world. I think the Israelis and the pro-Israelis in America are very well organized, well funded, and it's just to give you a small example, that the Amnesty reports on Israel as apartheid state last week, I did not see it in any newspaper in the US or any major paper. I get the Washington Post at home. I looked in every page, unless I missed it. Jim Zarkby, I know he's on the conference, he can correct me. The New York Times, 3 days passed and I read the New York Times every day after the report didn't cover it. So that gives you an example how the media in the US covers the Palestinian issue. If Palestinians get killed all the time, they never get covered in the US media. The only time I see a coverage was when a Palestinian American was killed outside Nablus about 2 weeks ago. And the media covered it because he was American, because his issue was raised with the State Department. But in general, the Palestinian issue in the US is clouded with lots of negative coverage. The Palestinian issue is not, unless there is a large scale of death and battles like the attack on Gaza a few months ago, we don't get much coverage in American media. When an Israeli gets killed or even wounded, including a settler, the press will cover it, and even the nightly news, which is most American TV outlets, they really don't cover much of the international politics, with the exception now when there's something the US is involved. It's Afghanistan, now it's Ukraine, Russia and the Ukraine. So since the issue is absent for many years, I've been here for 40 years in the US. And, I came to America during the invasion of South Lebanon as a student. The US media adopted the Israeli version of events, and what Israel said, it's exactly what the press will repeat. And when few members of Congress spoke out in the 80s criticizing Israel, we know Paul Findlay ended up losing his seat and ended up writing a book. It's called They Dare to Speak Out. Things are changing. They're changing very slowly and very little, but I think I'm optimistic. I think the future will see more changes. I mean, whenever you go on Twitter or social media, Amnesty was covered heavily. People were circulating the report, and many people were reading the report in the thousands. So I don't think monopoly over the media will work anymore. The reaction to the Gaza war last year was an example that the pro-Israelis could not have monopoly on their version of the story. So this is where we hope things will change. Also inside the US, within the Democratic Party, there are new elements. Many liberal Jews and many liberal members of Congress are changing their position and speaking up. Many members are speaking up. And in return, the Republican Party is getting worse. In the old days, 20, 30 years ago, Republicans usually criticized Israel more than Democrats. Paul Findlay was a Republican when he criticized Israel in 1982 and 83 in Israeli invasion. But now, I believe with the support of Sheldon Adelson and through a few other very rich Jewish donors, the Republican Party became solidly behind Israel. The other issue is the war on terrorism after 9/11. The pro-Israelis in America convinced politicians that Israel's war is America's war and vice versa, that they both fight the same enemy. It's terrorism that attacked America in 9/11. It's terrorism that's been attacking Israel since 1948. And many Republicans bought this story, with the exception of a wing of the Republican Party with libertarians. So the only other ideas you hear in the Republican Party comes within that small group of libertarians, which are represented by Cato and to another extent, the Quincy Institute. So there are more voices now. I have a good friend of mine at Cato. It's a conservative think tank. His name is Doug Pandau. And I don't think he will be upset that I'm telling the story. He wrote about everything in the world 10 years ago. He wrote criticizing Israel, and he was called by the head of Cato at that time, who was at one point former Israeli officer. He served in the Israeli army. He is a dual citizen. And he asked him not to write anything about Middle East. Things have changed. He's been writing criticism of Israel recently, and he's still a senior scholar at Cato. So I think these are the some good signs, and much better signs are happening in the Democratic Party. I think the young, also the other base of support for Israel comes from evangelicals. The young evangelicals are less supportive of Israel. There's polling done by Pew, I think 6 months ago, that shows that young evangelicals are less likely to support Israel, and they are more likely to call for social justice. So I can see these signs as positive signs with all the negative we see around us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with so many excellent speakers, we're left with just 15 minutes for discussion, which will be based on a question and answer format. If I can ask participants who haven't yet spoken to introduce themselves, just a name, perhaps an organization would suffice, and to limit your questions or comment to 1 minute would be very much appreciated. And to do so, if you use the raise hand function in the reactions. And I can see that Mahmoud has raised his hand. Mahmoud, please.
إذا كانت إسرائيل بتراهن إنها إذا بحبس الفلسطينيين أقسام زي ما هي مقسمتها هلا عندنا في البلد هان، هذا رهانهم خسران، لأنه إحنا الشعب هلا عندنا هان الشعب مش راح يتهجر كمان مرة من بيوته كمان مرة زي ما سووا فينا بال 48. الشعب اللي عندنا اللي هلا الموجودين الفلسطينيين راح يموتوا في أراضيهم، وإذا بضلهم متبعين الأسلوب اللي هم ماشيين فيه الإسرائيليين هان راح تؤدي لمجازر، لأنه إحنا الشعب اللي عندنا هان شعب ميت قلبه مات بطل. إذا هم مفكرين إنهم يهجرونا كمان مرة زي ما كانوا خايفين أهلنا بال 48، اليوم الناس صحيت، اليوم الناس بتموت في أراضيها وبتطلعش من أراضيها. هذا بس اللي بدي أوصله، لأنه اللي براهن إنهم يطلعونا من البلاد كمان مرة ونطلع بسهولة ونتهجر ونقعد بمخيمات، لا، اليوم الناس عندنا هان في فلسطين صاحيين على هذا الموضوع، بموتوا في أراضيهم وما بيطلعوش. وإذا ضلهم متبعين الأسلوب هذا معانا بالتهجير راح يؤدي هذا لمجازر وراح يصير مذابح عندنا في البلد، لأنه الناس هيك عندنا البلد ميتين الناس. اليوم الناس بتفضل إنها تموت في أراضيها هان ولا تتهجر كمان مرة. شكرا كثير لكم.
Thank you very much. And over to our translator. Thank you.
Yeah, our Mahmoud was saying that Israel is working to, if Israel thinks that it will succeed to make Palestinians leave their homes, especially in occupied Jerusalem, this is, of course, a dream that will never come true. And he also said that if Israel wants to force us as Palestinians to leave our city, he means the Jerusalem, this will eventually lead to bloodshed, and will never succeed in forcing Palestinians out of their homes. So, thank you.
Thank you both very much. Perhaps Nicholas Squires, without wanting to put you on the spot, I wonder if you had any comments on the discussion.
Right. I think Dr. Ralph Wilde's discussion on international law I found fascinating. I mean, the critical time is here, isn't it? As to internal and external self-determination. And it's really, I'm afraid that the human rights side is one thing, but it's the political exigencies that are going to be the driver there. I don't know whether Ralph Wilde wants to come back on that. You see, perhaps he's left us.
Yes, I'm here. So, well, yes, my argument though is that the law that would enable Palestinian liberation is not the law of apartheid, the law on occupation, the law relating to war crimes, all of the legal frameworks that are commonly, sometimes exclusively invoked Rather, it's the law on the use of force and the law of self-determination. And the issue with those areas of law is not that they're not enforced. I mean, clearly they're not enforced, because if the law was enforced there, the occupation would end, because the occupation only has a legal basis on the basis of self-defense, Israeli self-defense. And the law on the use of force requires self-defense only if it's necessary and proportionate in relation to the security threat. And the occupation fails that test. It's widely regarded not to meet the test of necessity and proportionality when it comes to self-defense. Therefore, the occupation is illegal in and of itself. And of course, that's not been enforced, right? So that's not been reversed. My argument, though, is that the fact that it's illegal in those terms, a violation of the law on the use of force, and also a violation of the law on self-determination, is not even appreciated by legal experts and by the so-called international community and by even human rights NGOs. That was my point in the article. So that supposedly scandalous report by Amnesty International, saying what, of course, many people have been saying already, including Palestinians for a long time, about apartheid, is about the way Israel treats the Palestinians under the conditions of domination. It's not about liberation. And if one tries to find Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, calling not for Palestinians to be treated equally, but for calling Palestinians to be liberated from occupation, to be freed, we would look in vain, because such reports do not exist. And I would therefore suggest that in some ways the so-called controversy over the apartheid report is a huge distraction away from the more fundamental problem of the occupation itself, as distinct from racial discrimination, apartheid, under the conditions of the occupation. And that is not being addressed in that report or by most of the mainstream Western commentary by even pro-Palestinian organizations, and certainly by, for example, Western European states, who actually are not calling for the occupation to end tomorrow, which is what they should be if they are concerned with implementing international law. And as I say, that's partly because of a misunderstanding about the law, which to a certain extent lawyers are responsible for. There is a general misunderstanding that international law is only about how the Palestinians are treated, and is not also about the more fundamental question of ending the domination in and of itself.
Thank you very much to both. Unless Nicholas has a response to that in turn. Could I see any hands for any questions or comments? I think I have a question myself, if not, for Amy Shalan, if I may. I mean, you spoke so powerfully about the role that the British state has played in repressing pro-Palestinian voices over the last period. I think most forcefully, I think, through the Prevent program. I was wondering what your thoughts were, excuse me, on the protests last summer. I don't know, or perhaps you were part of them, and what you think generated them. And the atrocities in occupied Palestine and Gaza and the resistance to them. But I don't think that alone would account for the 150, I think, thousand people in London. That kind of solidarity has to be organised over years and even decades. And I was wondering if you thought the groups that were doing that organising and the force behind it, the popular force behind it, has, if I can put it like this, been able to overcome counter forces like Prevent, or do you think it might have? We might have even rather seen 500,000 people if it wasn't for programs like that.
Well, I would say that shifts in consciousness and change comes about through cumulative activism over many years. So certainly I would say not just the kind of organizations that were organizing those protests, but a lot of work by lots of different organizations and individuals probably contributed to that. In terms of Prevent, I think also, I think that if you squeeze people so that they don't have an avenue to protest, it is still going to come out in some shape or form. It's very hard to say what would have happened in terms of mobilization were it not for the Prevent program. But I think it has had a huge impact on the way that people, I think the events on the ground were such that it was impossible to stop people from pouring out. And I think that people are joining up frameworks, that applicable frameworks seem very clear to them, that occupation applies, that apartheid applies, and that settler colonialism applies. Those sorts of connections are now being made despite all of the action to try and stamp that out. And I'm interested just actually in what Ralph Wilde was saying about kind of liberation and occupation. And I think that there is certainly that Palestine is now being seen much more as a struggle for liberation. Again, it kind of lost that over the years, and that is being rebooted, I would say, and that kind of happened around the Unity Intifada, where certainly Palestinians all over the world really connected with what was going on the ground. And I'm sure Shahid has got more to say about that too.
Oh, I think you're.
Sorry, Amy. Can you say it again? Like
just in terms of the kind of movement for liberation, the Palestinian movement as a struggle for liberation, and how that became much more mobilized last year with the Unity Intifada and Palestinians connecting in ways that perhaps they haven't done.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to be honest, like this whole period since May, I feel like it's just lumped into one period, and that it just seems, yeah, so long and so stressful. But we need to keep the morale up, and I think we are doing great at doing this. Like it was beautiful when. In May, we saw and then the whole world responding against the ethnic cleansing and the resistance, just beautiful all over Palestine and like all over the world. I think we are making like a shift, and it is coming. Of course, it will come at a price. But we have to be prepared to pay that price and keep on stay focused on our demands and just be really faithful that justice will be served and And yes, like I was just talking yesterday to a Zionist who was a medical student, and I thought that she was actually coming from a place of trying to understand where I come from. And I engaged with her because I felt, okay, maybe this is a student who haven't had a chance to be exposed to anything, you know, different, to the brainwashing and this like the story that the Zionists wants their children to grow up believing. And so I sort of like shared with her a few links and these things, and she was like trying genuinely to convince me that Zionism is about self-determination and liberation. And I'm like, how is this, how isn't this like contradictory, you know? Like there's so much moral and cognitive dissonance here. Like how is this liberation, how could a liberation or self-determination be realized as an apartheid state, a settler colonial state, a state that exists at the expense of erasing others? How is this self-determination? So like it is very easy, I feel, like to refute Zionist myths and lies, and we have a very, very strong case, and we are more powerful than ever. And let's not forget that South Africa apartheid film, Nelson Mandela left after 29 years of being in prison. My father, he spent 15 years in Israeli prisons for no charge and no fair trial. He was 19 when he was sentenced to 7 lifetimes that were cut short with the resistance managing to brook the 1985 prisoners exchange. And he never showed regret throughout his life, and he instilled those revolutionary ideas in his children, just as my grandparents did. And I think the younger generation, as Mahmoud said, is a lot more aware to the oppression and to the ways it manifests itself ideologically or militarily, or all these various ways that, yeah. Anyways, and yeah, just stay strong, everybody, and thank you. Sorry if I'm blah-blying, but I'm quite tired, and I just hope you all stay strong. Mahmoud, أنا شفتك، يعني شفت الفيديو تبعك ووصلني، كنت ببكي معك وحياة الله، كنت ببكي معك وأنا لما شفتك على السطح. يعني القهر ما تتخيلوا هذا الظلم ما عمره رح يدوم، وإن شاء الله النصر حليفنا. وطبعا مش رح نطلع ولا رح نركع إلا على حساب، يعني إلا على أرواحنا. شكرا كتير
الله يرضى عليكي ويسلم ايديك ويعطيك ألف عافية.
Thank you both so much, and that feels the perfect place to end this evening's discussion. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers, all extremely informative, and especially to Mahmoud, Solidarity, and to Shahid too. And I thank you again. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.